Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. See old friends, meet a few new ones, think great thoughts in honor of Zvi. So this is about new technologies, and this joint work with started with Nick and I looking through old issues of Technology Review, saying we can do something with it, and it's evolved a little bit since then, and we brought in Tariq Hassan, his colleague Tahoon, and then a couple of our students as well, Akash, who's now at the St. Louis Fed, and Marcella, who's at Harvard. And I think we're motivated, with an understanding that we all agree technology is linked to productivity growth and so forth. But in a way, we also know that there's been many concerns expressed about whether technology exacerbates income inequality and also inequality across regions. We can certainly hear this in, the more conservative, J.D. Vance and others on the more conservative side, but also in some of the more progressive observers. As was pointed out earlier today, there's been lots of work on diffusion of technologies, but a lot of it has been done in the context of individual technologies. And the notion here is to say, can we look across a wide variety of technologies on a single framework? And essentially, we're going to try to look at how these technologies diffuse and related to jobs. Yes, this is at an intersection of a variety of literatures, and clearly diffusion is one, which Zvi is the godfather of. There's also, of course, literature on technology and inequality, particularly the whole literature on skill-biased technology change, clustering, and of course, just a lot of text-to-data stuff. So we start with basically getting four data sources: patents themselves, wiki pages, earnings calls, and burning glass, which is essentially the transcript of job announcements or the text of job announcements that's been increasingly used in the economics literature. And we start by saying, let's look at influential innovations. What do we mean by that? In particular, what we want is the bigrams or the phraseology associated with them. To do this, we essentially say, what phrases have appeared in at least 1,000 citation-adjusted patents, and which represent a new language. So in other words, weren't in the corpus of historical American English as of 1970. Out of that, we end up with 35,000 novel bigrams associated with influential patents, but there's a problem, which is that it certainly has stuff that you might think we would want, like monoclonal antibodies, but it also has stuff that's not technologies. Either it's problems that maybe are newer problems, like greenhouse gases, or else are more Harvard Business Review kind of things, agile business models and stuff like that, which is novel, but not really, and it's a bigram, but it's not really technology. We started doing it the old-fashioned way, which was by hand, but with the help of some friendly referees, we realized we had to be a little more systematic in terms of doing this, and have sort of gravitated to essentially using a series of filtering based on Wikipedia, and particularly sort of based on the argument that the wiki profiles of things that are technologies seem to have the characteristics that certain kinds of fields appear again and again. Just to sort of throw out some examples here. In particular, you see things like applications, uses, operations, features, devices, and not, symptoms, adverse effects, management, business models, and so forth. And that sort of shrinks our pool of bigrams from 35,000 down to 4,000. Are they all? Is this perfect? I think the answer is not. We've done a rather laborious human audit on it, and I think our sense is that again, that there's no real perfection, but that we have a roughly 80% match up with the sort of human auditors in terms of the process there. Obviously, some of the bigrams, different bigrams, will map into the same page, right? So cloud computing and cloud services. We'll go to the same page. At the end of the day, we end up with, we call each of the set of bigrams mapping to the page technology. With that, we sort of define a second notion, which is for each of these bigrams, what is the emergence year? And what we mean by that is sort of where they begin the sort of process of growth or take-up in terms of patents that cite these bigrams. And here we put a couple examples of smartphone and digital video, where you see that there's sort of some nice inflection point where one sees some sort of dramatic acceleration in terms of the activity. You can ask the question, where do these things come from, which is what we call the pioneer locations. And in particular, what we define the pioneer locations on is the ones that represent half the patents in the 10 years after emergence. In some cases, there's just one place that accounts for it. So lane departure warning, essentially it's all eastern Michigan. Other cases, it's more scattered, like digital imaging, where you've got Rochester, which is where Kodak was, and Fort Collins, which is where HP Digital was, and so forth. But you already get a sense that Bay Area looms large in these areas. What we then do is match its jobs, and in particular, again, we sort of look at these bigrams, and if they appear, most of the work that's been done using burning glass is really just use the top stuff, the sort of summarized information, rather than the full text. But what we basically do is, of course, pull out the various bigrams associated with the stuff. We also try to classify the job announcements as to whether they're involving the development of the technologies, research, development, or producing them, which is sort of on the right, where they're doing chips for smart TVs, as opposed to using them, essentially using the smart device to take it out in your sales costs. About 2/3 are use and so forth. We then essentially look at the same bigram use in earnings calls, and we see a pretty striking pattern, which is that essentially the bigrams that are talked about a lot in earnings calls, and this is basically around 300,000 earnings calls of publicly traded companies over 20 years, also the ones that feature a lot in the job announcements. You have essentially a pretty linear relationship here with an R squared of almost 2/3, with the cloud and the laptop and the hybrid on the upper, and further down there we've got the ultrasonic horn and the suction filtration and so forth. They may be novel, but they don't seem to have had this impact across a variety of measures. One thing you see is that as one sort of progresses up this curve, right? And let me see what I can get it to do. Whether you talk about more postings or more earnings call mentions, what one sees is that technologies are progressively more concentrated. So if you essentially look at the patenting in these areas, one sees for the guys who had more than 500 earnings calls, essentially the top five regions, top five CBSAs, the two in Silicon Valley, Boston, New York, and Seattle, essentially are over 40%. For the ones which are down with the ultrasonic horn, it's only around 20%. In general, though, the basic story is that the emerging locations are incredibly concentrated, right? And these are the sort of pioneering locations with patenting. Essentially, on the order of 56% of the patents are either being derived from California or from the Northeast corridor. And essentially, with Silicon Valley being the most important. When we then go and essentially say what is happening to jobs, we see that the early jobs, so these are the jobs in the 5 years after the emergence of a technology, are incredibly concentrated as well. And perhaps not surprisingly, they're in the pioneer locations with the early patenting. right? So, that essentially you see this, real focus on the coast and lake. Over time, you get spread. So this is 6 to 10, and after 11 years, it's sort of a little bit of the pat of butter on the griddle sort of spreading out over time. That we can already, just eyeballing it, see that there's still a lot of activity in those original hubs. To try to look at this a little bit more systematically, we essentially try to look at the overrepresentation of jobs in a given CBSA year and relative to the number of jobs that are there, and sort of create a coefficient of variation, which is sort of a measure of how essentially concentrated it is. And what we see is over time, we see a sharp decline in terms of the coefficient of variation. But at the same time, when we look at it, it's sort of starting about 5.5 and going down to 3.5 after 30 years. Just to sort of calibrate that, if you look at college grads in the United States and just calculate their coefficient of variation, it's about 3. So even after 30 years, it's still more concentrated than that of the college grads. You can look at it, in regression format, and you see very much the same thing. So in a way, we have a picture where the technologies are initially very geographically clustered, but over time, the jobs that they create are spreading out, which is a little bit inconsistent with the, the sort of, the Vance or, the sort of hyper-progressive view that this is just something that benefits the elites on the coast. But when we look at the patterns, what we see is something quite different from high-skilled jobs, and here we're sort of sorting them based on college education, and low-skilled ones. And in particular, what one sees is the spread is quite rapid for the low-skilled jobs, but the high-skilled jobs remain more concentrated in the original hubs. And in fact, and similarly, when you look at use versus production, so the ones which are involved in R&D as opposed to the ones which are involved in just using the tablet to do the sales calls, you again see that the use jobs are spinning out relatively quickly, while the produce jobs are much slower. We can see the same thing in regressions that essentially the pioneer retains an advantage really throughout the period, but that gradually that depletes over time. Regions which are close to the pioneer as well have an advantage that are there, and that in particular for the high-skilled jobs, it's essentially almost more than 50% longer until the time when it's sort of fully dispersed. In any case, none of these is a case where the dispersion is particularly immediate. We also see this spreading in terms of the skill levels which are required, and in particular, one starts with, by and large, high-end jobs, and that sort of becomes broader mix, but more representation of lower-end jobs over time. Even so, if you sort of say, we're looking at here, what are the share of people with a college education? What we see is that even after 30 years, these technology-associated jobs are sitting at roughly 50%, as opposed to, the ACS number from 2020, which is around 27% of the U.S. population. And again, you sort of see, whether you look at college educated or average wage or lots of metrics, you see these sort of same patterns here. We try to spend some time thinking about what drives this, and certainly one possibility is that essentially just research becomes less important, right? That when you think about the early jobs, there's essentially a lot of, a lot of the jobs are doing research type activities. A second possibility we try to explore is that, essentially that there's training that's sort of provided elsewhere, which essentially makes it easier for for lower skilled people to use those technologies. And again, we try to use the text of the job announcements to try to pull out words associated with them and see where they go. We do see evidence consistent with the sort of idea that some of these patterns, the sort of spreading out of the decline in terms of skill levels, is associated with the decline in importance in terms of research, less so in terms of the training type stories. And we see this in a variety of different ways. So in a way, what we've tried to do here is to say, well, certainly diffusion has been something that's been well studied. It has tended to be studied in the context of individual technologies, innovations, or the like. And what we've tried to do here is try to create a way to look across a wide variety of impactful technologies and look at their spreads more in a cross-sectional kind of way. We really see this extreme initial concentration as to where the things are coming from. We see that the jobs associated with these technologies spread out over time, this region broadening, even if it's somewhat somewhat slowly. That you have this sort of strong initial skill bias that dissipates over time, which we call the skill broadening. But we also have this sort of interaction effect where the places which, right, so, in JD's formulation, right, Ohio is getting jobs associated with these new technologies, but they aren't really the best of the jobs, which remain stubbornly sticky and stubbornly sticky in Silicon Valley. And again, even though we're looking at a relatively recent period where you might think the diffusion process is much faster than it would have been in the 1950s or the like, we still see these sort of very slow kind of processes of the technologies moving out, with in many cases, particularly the pioneer locations and the high-skilled jobs being 40-plus years, they still have this overrepresentation of jobs here. Thanks.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to discuss this paper by Josh and colleagues. I'm very happy to have been invited to contribute to this very important and very rich and enlightening conference. So I'm Gaetan Rassenfosse from EPFL, Switzerland. All right, so I will not spend time summarizing the paper because you did an excellent job, Josh. I want to point, however, that it's a very ambitious and hugely interesting paper. It's very ambitious in its scope and in the question its answer. As you have seen, it collects millions of data, process this data. It asks hugely interesting, or at least it delivers hugely interesting stylized facts on which we know very little, and also provide data to the community, which you didn't mention. And as a bonus, I think it's a very good example of how to craft a paper to extract the substance of complex, large, messy data and deliver it in a key digestible insights. Besides the reasons of why we should care about this paper that you mentioned, in particular skill bias, technological change, or income inequality, here I will actually piggyback on Kevin Bryan's arguments about innovation really start having an impact as soon as it diffuses into society. And so this paper directly speaks to that, directly speaks into Griliches' oft-cited hybrid cone paper. And I think we have comparatively very little micro-level evidence about these issues. Today's sessions actually prove me wrong because I read a lot of paper on diffusion, and I think this is very encouraging. I also want to point that it's a very dense paper. There is close to 100 pages, millions of robustness tests, lots of reference cited. presented at dozens of conferences. So it's a very, very mature paper, which actually led me to, come up with this proposal. I believe there should be a code of honor between discussants and presenters that papers longer than 100 pages should not be subject to criticism. And in my code of honor, there would be 2 articles. Article 1, I should refrain, or discussants should refrain from making minor comments, because that will lead to robustness number 101. I will not change the paper. Article 2 is discussants should also refrain from making major comments, because you are most likely running out of juice and you will be frustrated.
Thanks, that was it.
So, thank you very much. Having said that, I'll try to navigate between my 2 articles and not infringing my own code of honor. Comment number 1, which really is a different paper. You're right, as in one of the limitations of the paper, that by its very nature, our data speak to job openings relating to novel technologies, but not to the possible destruction of existing positions by these technologies. Well, of course, you observed job postings. We would have loved to see creative destructions at play with this data. Having said that, and I think the slides are a bit messed up, but you actually, of course, do have information on jobs posted, but actually you also have information on jobs that were not posted. That is, the universe of jobs that could have been written and that were not written. So in a sense, all we will need is a way of identifying or guessing jobs that could have been written. And so a very naive prediction is actually last year's job posting. You could be a bit more fancy and maybe see whether there are leading or laggards regions, and maybe throw in LLM into the picture. But you could actually guess which jobs could have been written and study the extent to which the arrival of an innovation in a specific region disrupts your own predictions of which jobs among the universe of jobs that could have been written have not been written. So this is inspired a bit by Shi and Evans' paper, which they apply to the context of science, different questions, different contexts, different data, but it's kind of very much the idea, and it's really leveraged the power of LLMs, large language models, to have a hint or a window into this creative destruction through jobs posting. Talking about LLM, so this is not a comment. Article 1 is Article 2 are respected. This is a new paper. Comment number 2. If we were to redo the analysis today, I will actually probably do it differently, especially the first part. And I'm a bit troubled by the fact that technologies, of course, initially have different terms or are being described by different terms. So, for instance, a graphical user interface was initially known as WIMP, Windows Icons Menu Pointer, Man-Machine Interface, or Human-Computer Interface. And so I'm worried that the n-gram approach would fail to capture the very early days of technologies when names have not yet been standardized. And maybe there is even geographic variation in the early names, which would be damaging to your own analysis. So this is not me violating Article 2, asking you to redo the first step of your analysis. It's me giving advice to people who would like to do the analysis today. One would simply add a layer of LLM on top of the n-grams that you actually have already. You extract embedding vectors from these n-grams, and you cluster them, and all of a sudden you have like a bunch of synonyms, n-grams that speak to the same technology. Having said that, the Wikipedia trick is actually very interesting, where they consolidate n-grams that appear on the same web page to some extent. So that speaks or addresses a bit that concern. And the mobile phone example is a great example for that, because we actually see variations for the concept of mobile phones appearing in the Wikipedia page. But you may miss handheld communication device, portable communication device, mobile terminal, and lots of different terms that were used or still being used actually to describe mobile phone, and the proposed approach sounds less arbitrary. Moving to my last comment, and somehow building on the other one, somehow the method you propose forces inventions to originate from somewhere in the US. But this may not be the case in practice. And so, for instance, flash memory was famously invented in Japan by Toshiba in 1980, versus appearing in your data in 1991 in the US. So combining comment number 2 with so variations of name, with this comment forcing US location, together with the fact that you kind of impose a threshold for the emergence of technologies like this 10% growth, means that we do not observe the early life of inventions very well, let alone the place of birth of invention. And so I'd like to take an analogy of, your method with the Big Bang. So the Big Bang started, like the universe started with like hugely condensed matter, and then, the Big Bang came. In the first few seconds, actually, of the Big Bang, we had the period called the inflationary epoch, which lasted, a fraction of a second, actually, until, essentially, everything was messed up and, expanded very, very quickly. So you measure invention after this inflationary epoch, when kind of everything is in place for the phenomenon you observe to unfold. So I think it's important to keep that limitation in mind, because it will affect the way you interpret and you understand some of data. For instance, in terms of policy implication, the creation of inventions might be more, and I'm talking before you observe them, might be more geographically dispersed than the method suggests, which would have implications for regional innovation policies, which would also have maybe implications for how fast they spread within the US. Because if there has been pockets of these inventions throughout the country, maybe diffusion will be faster. Also, perhaps the fact that some technologies were invented elsewhere may also speed up diffusion, and I'm thinking here of the flash memory, which may have diffused faster in the US because firms had to move to cheap production faster, and so going quicker into low skills. This is me violating Article 1, so I'll stop here. Thank you.
So, although you promised to take up that additional minute, which you didn't, that gives us time.
All right, that
first
sounds
for
great.
a response. Josh.
Well, thank you, first of all, for the great comments. I'll just mention two things, just because they are things to contemplate. One of which is that, in a way, I feel like this paper is a little bit the analog of the China shock literature, or the reversal of the China shock literature, in the sense that there, the idea is to say, let's look at job destruction from Chinese imports, where they're using largely the filings with the USTR and so forth, and they're really able to look at the job lost in the factory making the TVs, but not able to look at the job created at Best Buy for people installing the giant Chinese TVs. And we have exactly the same problem in reverse. And I guess one of the tricky things that they face and we face is that the job creation and job destruction may not be happening in exactly the same place, right? So, the Uber is going to destroy jobs probably in the taxi industry or something like that, but that maybe you could capture. But there are many other cases where you could think that the job destruction is going to be happening far, far away in another industry. So it remains a sort of limitation that we have. I think it's a fascinating question as to how much, and this will be the last thing I say, is this whole question of how much you can go beyond the bigrams and n-grams into using LLMs in terms of trying to address some of these issues. We've had some success with it in some cases. So, for instance, we're doing something where we're essentially using venture capitalist reports in their portfolio companies and trying to look at the sentiment in terms of what's there. And they're pretty much saying the same things. The company's doing really well, it's having a little problems, management's turning over, and so forth. And feeding that into our little friends is actually extremely helpful, because it just sort of irons out the peculiarities of the language that an individual VC might use, but without really changing the content. And it seems like that's a real win in terms of that context. We've had some other instances. For instance, we tried this with our Chinese patent project in terms of saying, can we get the LLM to summarize the patent and then maybe do textual similarities based on the summarization rather than using the full text of the patents? And it's been well, first of all, it takes 15 seconds to think about it, which when you have 16 million Chinese patents is a rather leisurely kind of process. But the other thing is just that it seemed that when you looked, you know, again, this is sort of the, you know, Justice Brennan's know it when you see it kind of test, right? When you look at what they did in the summaries and what it then ends up doing in terms of that, it just couldn't, it glommed onto something and put it in the summary, but it certainly wasn't what you or I would do were we given the assignment of writing a summary in terms of that.
But our MBA students would.
Yeah, well, they would love it, right?
Exactly.
So you get something, but it's not always what you really want. So I think it remains, you know, I'm sure 5 years from now it'll be absolutely perfect and will be completely redundant. All right, thanks.